In the bustling port city of Genoa, where the Mediterranean lapped against ancient stone quays, a boy named Cristoforo Colombo came into the world in the autumn of 1451. His father, Domenico, worked as a wool weaver, his calloused hands moving rhythmically across the loom in their modest home near the city walls. His mother, Susanna Fontanarossa, tended to their household with quiet determination, raising Cristoforo and his siblings in the crowded, vibrant streets where merchants haggled and sailors told tales of distant shores. The Genoa of Christopher's childhood was a city alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. The great maritime republic competed fiercely with Venice for control of Mediterranean trade routes, and its harbor bristled with vessels bound for exotic destinations. Young Christopher would have wandered those docks, breathing in the salt air mixed with the scent of spices from the east, watching sailors load and unload cargo from lands he could barely imagine. Unlike the sons of wealthy merchants who received formal education in Latin and mathematics, Christopher's schooling was limited. His father expected him to learn the family trade, to become another weaver in a long line of craftsmen. But the boy's eyes kept drifting toward the harbor, toward the horizon where sea met sky. He learned what he could from the sailors, absorbing their stories and their rough knowledge of winds and currents, of stars and navigation. By his teenage years, Christopher had grown tall and strong, with reddish hair that would later turn prematurely white. His blue eyes held an intensity that suggested he was already dreaming of something beyond the weaver's loom, beyond even the familiar waters of the Mediterranean. The sea called to him with a voice he could not ignore, promising adventure and perhaps a destiny far greater than his humble birth suggested. His family's fortunes were modest and sometimes precarious. Domenico's weaving business faced constant competition, and there were lean times when the Colombo household struggled to make ends meet. This economic instability may have fueled young Christopher's ambition, his hunger for something more than the uncertain life of a Genoese craftsman. He wanted wealth, certainly, but more than that, he wanted glory, recognition, a name that would echo through history. The political landscape of Genoa shaped the young man's worldview. The city-state was a republic, but one dominated by wealthy merchant families and riven by factional conflicts. Christopher learned early that success required not just skill but also patronage, the ability to win the favor of powerful men. This lesson would serve him throughout his life, as he spent years courting kings and queens, seeking someone who would believe in his vision and finance his dreams. In his late teens, Christopher began his true education in seamanship. He likely started with short coastal voyages, learning the basics of navigation and ship handling on relatively safe Mediterranean runs. These early experiences taught him to read the weather, to understand the moods of the sea, to work alongside rough crews where a man's worth was measured by his competence and courage. The boy who had grown up among wool and thread was transforming into a sailor, his hands now learning the feel of rope and sail rather than wool and loom. The Mediterranean was not just a highway for trade but also a battlefield. Genoese and Venetian fleets clashed regularly, and piracy was a constant threat. Christopher's early voyages would have carried an element of danger that made them all the more thrilling to an ambitious young man. Every journey beyond the harbor was an adventure, every successful return a victory. He was building not just skills but also confidence, the unshakable belief that he was destined for something extraordinary. By his early 20s, Christopher Columbus, as history would know him in the Latinized version of his name, had made a decisive break from his father's trade. He was a sailor now, body and soul committed to the sea. The weaver's loom held no appeal for him. His loom was the deck of a ship, his thread the wake stretching behind the stern, his pattern the routes traced across the waters of a world he had only begun to explore. Chapter 2. Sailing Distant Seas. The young Columbus threw himself into the life of a merchant sailor with fierce determination. Throughout the 1470s, he sailed on various Genoese trading vessels, each voyage expanding his knowledge and his horizons. These were not pleasure cruises, but working passages where every man aboard had to earn his keep. Christopher learned navigation by doing, calculating positions from the stars, reading the subtle signs of current and wind, memorizing the dangerous coasts and safe harbors of the Mediterranean world. His voyages took him along the Italian coast to the islands of the eastern Mediterranean, and possibly as far as the trading posts in the Aegean Sea. Each port offered new sights and sounds, new languages and customs. In Constantinople, if he reached it, he would have seen the great Byzantine church of Hagia Sophia, by then converted to a mosque after the Ottoman conquest. In the Levantine ports, caravans arrived bearing the silks and spices of the Orient, goods that commanded extraordinary prices in European markets. Christopher understood that whoever could find a better route to these treasures would become unimaginably wealthy. In 1476, Columbus's life took a dramatic turn during a voyage that nearly ended in disaster. He was sailing with a Genoese convoy when it was attacked by French privateers off the coast of Portugal. The battle was fierce and chaotic, ships grappling in close combat, cannons roaring, sailors fighting hand to hand. Columbus's vessel was set ablaze. As the ship began to sink, he made a desperate choice. He jumped into the sea, clinging to a floating oar, and swam for his life. The shore was 6 miles distant, an almost impossible distance for a man in the water. But Columbus possessed extraordinary determination and physical strength. Stroke by stroke, clinging to that oar when exhaustion threatened to drag him under, he fought his way toward land. Hours later, he dragged himself onto a Portuguese beach, alive but with nothing to his name. This survival would prove to be the most fortunate disaster of his life, for Portugal would become his gateway to the Atlantic and to the knowledge that would shape his future ambitions. He made his way to Lisbon, Portugal's capital and one of the most important maritime centers in Europe. Here, Columbus entered a world far more sophisticated than anything he had known in Genoa. Portuguese navigators were the most advanced in Europe, pushing down the African coast in search of a sea route to India. Prince Henry the Navigator, though dead for some years, had established a tradition of exploration that continued to drive Portuguese expeditions ever further into unknown waters. In Lisbon, Columbus found himself at the cutting edge of geographical knowledge. He settled into the city's maritime community, supporting himself through chart making and book selling while learning everything he could about navigation and exploration. The Portuguese had developed advanced navigation techniques, including the use of the quadrant and astrolabe to measure latitude by the stars. Columbus absorbed this knowledge eagerly, understanding that these tools could unlock the secrets of the open ocean. He studied the wind patterns of the Atlantic, learning about the trade winds that blew steadily from Africa toward the west, and the westerlies that could carry a ship back to Europe from higher latitudes. In Lisbon, Columbus also found love. He married Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, a young woman from a minor noble family with connections to Portugal's exploration efforts. Her father had been a navigator and the governor of Porto Santo, an island in the Madeiras. This marriage elevated Columbus's social standing and gave him access to his father-in-law's charts and papers. More importantly, it connected him to the network of Portuguese explorers and merchants who were actively engaged in discovering new trade routes and new lands. Through his wife's family, Columbus gained access to Porto Santo itself, spending time on this Atlantic island that served as a Portuguese outpost. Here, on the edge of the known world, he could study the ocean more directly. He observed the driftwood and strange plants that washed ashore from the west, carried by ocean currents from somewhere beyond the horizon. Local fishermen told stories of seeing islands in the distance during certain weather conditions, tantalizing glimpses of land that might lie further out in the Atlantic. Columbus also sailed on at least one Portuguese expedition down the African coast, possibly reaching Guinea. These voyages showed him the wealth that could be extracted from direct access to African gold and the horrifying but lucrative trade in enslaved people that Portuguese captains were developing. He saw firsthand how exploration could lead to riches and how bold captains who ventured into unknown waters could return with fortunes and fame. If the Portuguese could grow wealthy by sailing south around Africa, might there not be an even better route by sailing west across the Atlantic? The idea that would consume the rest of his life was beginning to crystallize in Columbus's mind. Ancient geographers had long known the earth was round, and scholars debated the size of the globe and what lay on its far side. Columbus began to believe that by sailing west across the Atlantic he could reach the eastern shores of Asia, the lands of China and Japan that Marco Polo had described. This wasn't an original idea, but Columbus would become its most persistent advocate, driven by ambition, conviction, and perhaps by a touch of divine inspiration that he genuinely believed guided his path. Chapter 3. The Great Enterprise. Throughout the late 1470s and into the 1480s, Christopher Columbus became increasingly obsessed with his great idea. He devoured every geographical text he could find, studying the works of ancient and medieval scholars, marking passages and making notes in the margins. He read Pierre Dailly's Imago Mundi, a comprehensive geography that synthesized classical and contemporary knowledge. He studied Ptolemy's ancient geography with its calculations of the Earth's size. Most tantalizingly, he pored over Marco Polo's account of his travels to the court of Kublai Khan, with its descriptions of Japan as an island rich in gold, lying in the ocean east of China. Columbus was not a trained scholar, and his understanding of these texts was sometimes flawed. But what he lacked in formal education, he made up for in determination and selective reading. He chose to believe calculations that made the earth smaller than it actually was, and he convinced himself that Asia extended much further east than it did. These errors led him to conclude that Japan lay only about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands, a distance that, while daunting, was potentially achievable. In reality, the distance to Japan was nearly 10,000 miles, with an entire unknown continent standing in between. His theory rested on several key assumptions. First, that the earth was indeed round, a fact that learned men generally accepted, despite later myths about medieval flat earth believers. Second, that by sailing west, one would eventually reach the east. Third, that the distance was not impossibly far. And fourth, that the journey would be worth the risk because it would provide direct access to the spices, silks, and gold of Asia without the need to pass through Muslim-controlled territories or pay the steep prices demanded by Middle Eastern merchants. Columbus began to speak of his plan as La Empresa de las Indias, the enterprise of the Indies. He was convinced that God had chosen him for this mission, that divine providence would guide his ships across the unknown ocean. This wasn't mere ego. Columbus appears to have genuinely believed he was fulfilling a sacred destiny. He saw himself as an instrument of Christian expansion, someone who would bring the gospel to the peoples of Asia and perhaps even find the legendary Christian king Prester John, who was said to rule somewhere in the east. But conviction alone could not buy ships and provisions for a voyage into the Atlantic. Columbus needed a sponsor, preferably a wealthy monarch who could afford the considerable expense and risk of such an expedition. He began with Portugal, the obvious choice given his residence in Lisbon and Portugal's leadership in exploration. Around 1484, he presented his plan to King John II, requesting ships and royal backing for his enterprise. King John's response would haunt Columbus for years. The Portuguese monarch was interested in finding a route to Asia, certainly, but his experts were skeptical of Columbus's calculations. They believed the Earth was larger than Columbus claimed and that Asia was further away. They were right, of course, though neither they nor Columbus could know that an entirely new world lay between Europe and Asia. The royal committee that examined Columbus's proposal rejected it as impractical. More gallingly, from Columbus's perspective, the king sent a secret expedition to test the idea without him, a voyage that turned back after encountering storms, apparently confirming the committee's doubts. Bitter and disappointed, Columbus left Portugal. His wife Philippa had died, leaving him with a young son, Diego, to care for. He decided to try his luck in Spain, the other great Iberian power that might have the resources and ambition to support his enterprise. In late 1485, Columbus crossed the border into Spain, carrying letters of introduction and his detailed proposal, beginning what would become 7 long years of waiting, pitching, and hoping for royal approval. Spain was a newly unified kingdom, formed by the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. But in 1485, the Catholic monarchs were preoccupied with completing the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to drive Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, still held out, and Isabella and Ferdinand were dedicating their resources to its conquest. Columbus's grand enterprise would have to wait until more pressing matters were resolved. Still, Columbus managed to gain an audience with the monarchs and present his case. Isabella, in particular, seemed intrigued by the passionate Genoese sailor with his grand vision and his absolute certainty. But she couldn't commit resources while the Granada campaign continued. Columbus was told to wait, given a modest allowance to live on, and left to cool his heels in the court, lobbying and hoping while years slipped away. The waiting was agonizing for a man of Columbus's temperament. He was approaching 40, no longer young by the standards of the age. He had a son to support and a destiny he believed he was meant to fulfill. He spent time at the monastery of La Rábida near the port of Palos, where sympathetic friars provided food and shelter and encouraged him to persist. He pitched his plan to various nobles and courtiers, gaining some supporters, but never enough backing to proceed without royal approval. At one desperate point, he even sent his brother Bartholomew to England and France to seek support from those monarchs, but without success. During these years of waiting, Columbus refined his arguments and his demands. He wasn't asking merely to captain an expedition. He wanted titles, honors, and a share of any wealth discovered. He demanded to be made admiral of the ocean sea, governor of any lands found, and granted 10% of all profits from the enterprise in perpetuity. These were extraordinary demands from a foreign sailor of humble origins, and they likely hindered his cause. But Columbus would not lower his expectations. He knew the value of what he offered, and he insisted on being compensated accordingly. By 1492, Columbus was nearly ready to give up on Spain. Granada had finally fallen to Spanish forces, ending Muslim rule in Iberia. But still, the monarchs hesitated. Columbus prepared to leave for France, to try his luck with the French king. But at the last moment, as he rode away from the Spanish court, a messenger galloped after him. Queen Isabella had changed her mind. She would support his enterprise after all, pawning her own jewels if necessary to finance the expedition. Christopher Columbus's years of waiting were finally over. Chapter 4. Ships and Preparation. The spring of 1492 was a time of both triumph and hurried preparation for Christopher Columbus. Queen Isabella's backing came with significant support but also demanding conditions. The Catholic monarchs agreed to finance most of the expedition and granted Columbus many of the titles and privileges he had demanded, but they also expected results. He would have a fleet, yes, but not a large one. Just 3 ships, and those were to be supplied from the small port of Palos, which owed the crown a debt of service. Columbus traveled to Palos with royal orders requiring the town to provide 2 caravels for his enterprise. The local authorities were less than enthusiastic about this demand. The expedition seemed foolhardy to many, a voyage into unknown waters led by a foreign captain with wild theories about reaching Asia by sailing west. Local ship owners were reluctant to risk their vessels, and experienced sailors were not eager to sign on for what might be a one-way journey into the void. Columbus faced skepticism and outright resistance from the maritime community he was depending on. His fortunes improved when the Pinzon family of Palos agreed to support the venture. Martín Alonso Pinzon was a respected sea captain, an experienced navigator whose participation lent credibility to the enterprise. Martín and his brothers, Vicente Yáñez Pinzon and Francisco, threw their weight behind Columbus, helping to recruit crew members and prepare the ships. With the Pinzons involved, what had seemed like a desperate gamble began to look like a serious expedition. The fleet that took shape consisted of 3 vessels, each suited to different roles. The largest was the Santa Maria, a now or carrack of about 100 tons, which would serve as Columbus's flagship. She was broad-beamed and capacious, able to carry substantial provisions, but she was also the slowest of the 3 ships. The Pinta and the Niña were smaller caravels, faster and more maneuverable, better suited to exploration and working close to shore. The Pinta would be captained by Martín Alonso Pinzon, the Niña by his brother Vicente Yáñez, while Columbus commanded the Santa Maria. Fitting out the ships required careful planning. They needed provisions for a voyage of unknown duration. Columbus estimated about a month to reach Asia, but prudent preparation required supplies for far longer. The holds were filled with salt pork and beef, hardtack biscuits that could last for months without spoiling, dried fish, cheese, beans and lentils, olive oil, vinegar and wine and water in wooden casks. They carried live animals for fresh meat, chickens, and perhaps pigs. They loaded trade goods, glass beads, brass bells, cheap jewelry, red caps, and other items Columbus thought would appeal to Asian peoples based on Marco Polo's accounts. The ships also carried weapons and armor. The crew would need to defend themselves if they encountered hostile peoples, and Spanish sailors of this era expected any voyage might involve combat with pirates or foreign vessels. Crossbows, swords, pikes, and several small cannons called lombards were stored aboard. The expedition was prepared for trade, certainly, but also for conflict should it arise. Finding qualified crew members proved challenging despite the Pinson's help. Columbus needed pilots who understood navigation, experienced seamen who could handle the ships in any weather, ship's boys to do the menial work, a surgeon to tend to injuries and illness, and various craftsmen who might be needed for repairs far from any port. In the end, the expedition assembled about 90 men total across the 3 ships. Most were Spanish, particularly from the Andalusian region around Palos, but there were a few foreigners, including an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Venetian. Some were experienced sailors seeking adventure or profit. Others were petty criminals who joined to escape punishment. Columbus was meticulous in his preparations, checking and rechecking provisions, making sure each ship had proper navigational instruments, compasses, hourglasses to measure time, quadrants for measuring the sun's angle. He carried several charts, though none would be much use once they sailed beyond the Canary Islands into waters no cartographer had mapped. He kept his own counsel about the route, planning to sail first to the Canaries to catch the trade winds that he had learned about from his years in Portuguese service, winds that blew steadily toward the west. The final weeks before departure were filled with both excitement and anxiety. Columbus's son Diego was placed in the care of trusted friends, as the admiral would be gone for months, perhaps a year or more. Confessions were heard and mass was said. Wills were written by men who knew they might not return. Families said tearful farewells at the docks. The skeptics in Palos predicted the ships would sail off the edge of the world or be lost forever in the vastness of the ocean. But Columbus remained confident, his faith in his mission unshaken. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the 3 ships weighed anchor and caught the tide, sailing out of the harbor at Palos and into the Atlantic. As the Spanish coast fell away behind them, Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, watching the familiar world disappear. Ahead lay the unknown ocean and the destiny he had pursued for so many years. He believed God was guiding him toward Asia and glory. He had no idea that he was about to stumble upon an entire hemisphere that no European had known existed, and in doing so change the course of human history forever. Chapter 5. Into the Unknown. The 3 ships sailed south along the African coast, making for the Canary Islands, where Columbus planned a final stop before heading into the open Atlantic. The voyage to the Canaries was routine, the waters familiar to Spanish sailors, but even this short leg of the journey revealed problems. The Pinta's rudder became damaged, forcing repairs that delayed the fleet. It was September before they finally departed the Canaries, setting course due west into the unknown. Columbus established the routines that would govern the voyage. The ships would sail day and night when winds permitted, covering as much distance as possible. The speed would be measured by throwing a piece of wood overboard and timing how long it took to pass from bow to stern. Direction would be maintained by compass, with the helmsman steering to keep the heading Columbus specified. Each day, Columbus would calculate the distance traveled and record it in his log, tracking their progress across the featureless ocean. But Columbus also made a fateful decision that would cause considerable trouble. He chose to keep two separate logs, one public and one private. In the log that his crew could see, he recorded shorter daily distances than they actually traveled, hoping to prevent panic as they sailed further and further from land. In his private log, he recorded what he believed to be the true distances. This deception was born of fear that his crew might mutiny if they realized how far from Spain they had ventured, but it also reflected Columbus's tendency towards secrecy and control. The first days of the voyage were blessed with favorable winds. The fleet sailed steadily westward, making good progress. The weather was fine, the sea relatively calm. Columbus noted with satisfaction how the trade winds blew consistently from the east, pushing them along. But as days turned to weeks with no sight of land, unease began to grow among the crews. They were further from shore than most had ever sailed, in waters no European had ever navigated, following a captain whose confidence struck some as arrogance and others as madness. By late September, subtle signs of mutiny began to appear. Sailors gathered in small groups, muttering about the foolishness of this voyage. Some openly questioned whether Columbus knew what he was doing. The Pinzon brothers, particularly Martin Alonso, began to show signs of impatience, sometimes sailing ahead of the flagship as if eager to be first to sight land, or perhaps considering whether to abandon Columbus and turn back. Columbus responded to this unrest with a combination of confidence and careful observation of the sea. He pointed out birds flying overhead, suggesting land must be near. He showed the crew floating weeds, claiming they indicated proximity to shore. Some of these signs were genuine. They were crossing the Sargasso Sea filled with floating Gulf weed. But Columbus interpreted every piece of driftwood and every bird as proof they were about to reach land, even when they weren't. The admiral also made promises of rewards. Queen Isabella had offered a substantial prize to whoever first sighted land, and Columbus embellished this, suggesting that great wealth awaited them in the rich lands of Asia. He painted verbal pictures of cities roofed in gold, of spices and silks for the taking, of glory and honor. Some men believed him, others just wanted to turn back toward Spain while they still could. By early October, the situation was becoming critical. They had been at sea for a month, far longer than most of the crew had expected. Provisions were holding up, but morale was not. There were heated arguments aboard the flagship. Some sailors demanded they turn back immediately. Columbus consulted with his captains and agreed to a compromise. They would continue west for 3 more days, and if land was not sighted by then, they would turn back and admit defeat. Those 3 days must have been agonizing for Columbus. All his years of planning, all his grand theories and absolute conviction would be for nothing if they failed to find land. He studied the horizon constantly, looking for any sign, a bird, a cloud formation that might indicate an island, anything that would justify his faith. The crew grew more tense with each passing hour, counting down the time until they could abandon this mad enterprise and sail for home. But then, on October 11th, the signs became unmistakable. Flocks of birds passed overhead, clearly flying toward land. A carved stick was pulled from the water, and a branch with fresh berries on it. The crew of the Pinta retrieved a cane, a small board, and another carved stick. These were not natural driftwood, but evidence of human hands, of land, of vindication. Columbus ordered the fleet to continue through the night, every man straining his eyes toward the western horizon. At 2 in the morning on October 12th, 1492, under a moon 3 days past full, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana aboard the Pinta saw what everyone had been desperately hoping for, a dark line of land against the lighter sky. His shout of "Tierra, tierra, land, land," echoed across the water. The Pinta fired a cannon to alert the other ships. After more than a month at sea, after crossing over 3,000 miles of open ocean, they had reached land. Columbus believed they had reached an island off the coast of Asia, perhaps near Japan. He had no idea that he had discovered, from a European perspective, an entirely new world. The land ahead was a small island in what would later be called the Bahamas, inhabited by people who had never seen a European ship or a white man. As dawn broke and the 3 ships approached the island, a chapter in history was closing and another, more momentous one, was about to begin. Chapter 6. First Encounters. As the sun rose on October 12th, Columbus and his men could see the island clearly, a low green land with beaches of brilliant white sand and waters of impossible blue. Trees grew down to the water's edge, and smoke from fires indicated human habitation. After the long weeks of seeing nothing but ocean, this sight must have seemed like paradise to the weary sailors. Columbus ordered the ships to anchor, and he prepared to go ashore with the Pinzon brothers and a selection of his men. They loaded into small boats and rowed toward the beach, Columbus dressed in his finest clothes and carrying the royal banner of Spain. He had prepared for this moment, planned what he would say and do. This was to be his great triumph, the moment that would justify everything. The years of rejection, the months of waiting at the Spanish court, the dangerous voyage across the unknown ocean. When the boats reached the shallow water, Columbus stepped out first, wading through the warm Caribbean water to stand on solid ground for the first time in over a month. The admiral immediately knelt and kissed the sand, thanking God for bringing them safely to land. Then he stood and formally took possession of the island in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He named the place San Salvador, Holy Savior. A cross was planted in the beach, prayers were said, legal declarations were read aloud. To Columbus, this was obviously an island off the coast of Asia, and these ceremonies established Spanish sovereignty over what he assumed were outlying lands of the Great Khan's empire. But the island was not uninhabited. Watching from the trees were the Taino people who actually lived on San Salvador. These indigenous islanders had never seen ships with sails, men with white skin, or the strange animals and tools the Europeans brought with them. Cautiously at first, then with growing curiosity, they emerged from the forest and approached the beach. Columbus's journal entries describe them as a gentle, handsome people who went naked, or nearly so, with copper-colored skin and straight black hair. They wore ornaments of gold and seemed friendly and welcoming. The Europeans and Taino communicated through signs and gestures as they shared no common language. Columbus immediately began thinking in terms of trade and potential conversion. These people could be brought to Christianity and made useful to the Spanish crown. His observations were those of a colonizer, even as he noted their kindness and generosity. The Taino brought gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and small pieces of gold. They seemed willing to trade almost anything for the glass beads and hawk's bells the Spanish offered. Columbus noted with satisfaction that they appeared to have no iron weapons, only spears tipped with bone or wood. This meant they could be easily conquered if necessary. From the very first encounter, Columbus was assessing these people not as equals to be respected, but as subjects to be ruled or resources to be exploited. Over the following days, Columbus explored the immediate area, visiting several nearby islands. He kidnapped several Taino men to serve as guides and interpreters, simply taking them aboard the ships against their will. This act of violence, committed almost casually, set a terrible precedent for Spanish relations with indigenous peoples. Columbus justified it by saying these captives would learn Spanish and help the Europeans find the gold and spices they sought. But it was kidnapping nonetheless, a fundamental violation of these people's freedom. The fleet moved through the Bahamas, the admiral constantly searching for signs of the wealthy Asian kingdoms he expected to find. The Taino spoke of larger islands to the south and west, places with more gold. Columbus took this as confirmation that Japan or China must be nearby. He missed entirely that the people he had encountered had lived in these islands for thousands of years, that they had their own rich culture and history that had nothing to do with Asia. In late October, the fleet reached a much larger island that the Taino called Cuba. Columbus believed this must be part of the mainland of Asia, perhaps China itself. He sent scouts inland to find cities and the court of the Great Khan, but they returned having found only small villages of thatched houses. The Taino of Cuba lived simply, growing crops of maize, yams, and cassava, fishing the rich waters and crafting beautiful objects. But they were not the sophisticated Asian civilizations Columbus had expected, with their cities of gold and vast treasuries of spices. Despite not finding the wealth he had promised, Columbus remained optimistic. He noted everything that might be valuable, the gold ornaments the natives wore, even if they were small, the possibility of trade in cotton, which grew abundantly, the fine harbors that could serve as bases for future expeditions. He claimed everything he saw for Spain, planting crosses and reading declarations of possession that the Taino could not understand. In December, the fleet reached another large island, which the Taino called Ayiti or Quisqueya, but which Columbus named Hispaniola. The eastern portion was governed by a chief named Guacanagari, who proved friendly and welcoming to the strange visitors. Here, Columbus saw more gold ornaments and heard tales of a region in the interior where gold could be found in rivers. This was more encouraging. Perhaps the great riches were not on small islands, but on these larger lands. The indigenous peoples Columbus encountered during these months were remarkably generous and peaceful. They fed the Europeans, traded with them freely, and welcomed them into their communities. Columbus noted their gentle natures in his journal, even as he calculated how easily they could be enslaved. He saw their nakedness as evidence of primitiveness rather than adaptation to a tropical climate. He interpreted their lack of iron weapons as weakness rather than evidence of a peaceful society. His European assumptions shaped every observation, blinding him to the sophisticated cultures he was actually encountering. On Christmas Eve, 1492, disaster struck. The Santa Maria ran aground on a reef off the north coast of Hispaniola. Despite frantic efforts to save her, the flagship was lost. The crew managed to salvage most of the provisions and equipment, but they were now left with only 2 ships, not enough to carry all the men back to Spain. Columbus made a fateful decision. He would establish a settlement, leaving behind about 40 volunteers who would wait for his return while searching for gold. Using timbers from the wrecked Santa Maria, they built a small fort that Columbus named La Navidad, the Nativity, because of the date of its founding. Chief Guacanagari provided land and assistance, apparently seeing the strange visitors as potential allies. Columbus promised to return soon with more ships and supplies. On January 4th, 1493, he set sail for Spain aboard the Niña, with Martín Alonso Pinzón following in the Pinta. Behind them, they left the first European settlement in the Americas, a tiny outpost of men who would wait for a return voyage, never imagining the chain of events they were part of initiating. Chapter 7: Return and Triumph. The voyage back to Spain tested Columbus and his crew as severely as the westward journey had. They faced fierce winter storms in the North Atlantic that nearly sank both ships. Mountainous waves crashed over the decks and howling winds shredded sails. The crew prayed to the Virgin Mary and various saints, vowing pilgrimages if they survived. Columbus, who had kept his composure crossing the unknown ocean, now faced the real possibility that he might die within a few hundred miles of home, his great discovery unknown to the world. In mid-February, the storm separated the two ships. Columbus on the Niña was blown far off course and forced to make an emergency landing in the Azores, Portuguese-controlled islands in the mid-Atlantic. The Portuguese authorities there were suspicious of his claims and briefly detained some of his crew, seeing him as a rival trespassing in waters they considered their own. Only after tense negotiations was Columbus allowed to continue towards Spain. But the episode showed that Portugal viewed his discoveries with jealousy and concern. The Niña finally reached the port of Palos on March 15, 1493, more than 7 months after departure. Hours later, the Pinta also arrived. Martín Alonso Pinzón had been blown to the northern coast of Spain and had been trying to return home. The miraculous return of both ships against such odds seemed to Columbus to be proof of divine favor. But Pinzón was gravely ill and died within days of arriving home, never enjoying whatever glory might have come from the voyage. Columbus thus became the sole voice shaping the narrative of the expedition. News of the discovery spread rapidly. Columbus traveled to Barcelona, where Ferdinand and Isabella held court, bringing with him the evidence of his achievement: several Taíno captives dressed in their native attire, parrots and other exotic birds, gold ornaments and samples of cotton, various plants including tobacco and maize, and elaborate stories of the lands he had found. He claimed to have reached islands near Asia, perhaps even Japan, and spoke of vast resources and peoples ready for conversion to Christianity. The Catholic monarchs received Columbus with extraordinary honor. In an audience that became famous across Europe, they had him sit in their presence, an unusual mark of respect, and listened attentively to his account of the voyage. Isabella and Ferdinand saw enormous potential in what Columbus had found. Even if these were just islands and not the mainland of Asia, they represented new lands to claim, new souls to convert, and potential wealth to fund Spain's ambitions. The fact that Portugal had rejected Columbus and missed this opportunity made Spain's success all the sweeter. Columbus was confirmed in all the titles and privileges promised before the voyage. He was now Don Cristobal Colon, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the Indies. He was granted a coat of arms, a noble status that elevated him far above his origins as a Genoese weaver's son. The poor boy from Genoa was now a Spanish nobleman. feted at court and celebrated as the man who had achieved what everyone said was impossible. But there were complications brewing beneath the celebration. Portugal's King John II was furious that Columbus had succeeded and that Spain now claimed these new lands. The question of who owned what in the Atlantic threatened to escalate into war between the two Iberian powers. To prevent conflict, both kingdoms appealed to Pope Alexander VI, who issued a series of papal bulls attempting to divide the world between Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence. These culminated in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic. Lands discovered east of the line would be Portuguese. Lands west of it would be Spanish. This division of the world between two European powers, made without consulting the millions of people who actually lived in the affected regions, exemplified the arrogance of European colonialism. The Pope and the Iberian kingdoms assumed they had the right to give away lands inhabited by others, to divide up entire continents as if they were empty spaces on a map. This attitude would shape the conquest and colonization that followed, with devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. Columbus spent much of 1493 preparing for a second, much larger voyage. The monarchs enthusiastically supported this new expedition, providing 17 ships and over 1,000 men, sailors, soldiers, farmers, and priests. This was no longer an exploratory voyage, but a colonizing expedition intended to establish permanent Spanish settlements, find gold, and convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity. Columbus was to be not just a discoverer, but a governor, charged with establishing Spanish rule over the lands he had found. The goals of the second voyage reflected a shift in Spanish thinking. The first voyage had been about proving that Columbus's theory was correct and that new lands could be reached by sailing west. The second voyage was about exploitation and control. Spain wanted to extract wealth from these new territories, particularly gold. They wanted to establish plantations and settlements that would generate profit. And they wanted to spread Catholicism, partly from genuine religious conviction and partly as a means of asserting cultural dominance over indigenous peoples. Columbus himself was confident and commanding as he prepared for this return. He had proven himself correct, had achieved the recognition he had always craved, and now possessed the means to build something lasting in the lands he had discovered. But he was a sailor and an explorer, not an administrator or a diplomat. The skills that had gotten him across the ocean, stubborn determination, unwavering self-confidence, and an ability to inspire men to follow him into the unknown, were not the skills needed to govern a colony and manage relationships with indigenous peoples. In September 1493, the great fleet set sail from Spain, bound for Hispaniola. Columbus stood on the deck of his new flagship, watching the Spanish coast recede, his mind full of plans and ambitions. He was returning not just to explore, but to rule, to create a Spanish empire in what he still believed were the outlying islands of Asia. He had no idea how difficult and tragic the next phase of his life would be, or how his failures as a governor would tarnish the glory of his achievements as a navigator. Chapter 8. The Governor's Burden. The second voyage began with favorable winds and high spirits. Columbus's fleet was impressive, 17 ships carrying over 1,200 men, along with horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, and seeds for planting European crops. This was a colonizing force, equipped to establish permanent settlements and begin extracting whatever wealth these new lands offered. They followed a more southerly route than the first voyage, discovering new islands including Dominica, Guadeloupe, and Puerto Rico, before arriving at Hispaniola in November 1493. What Columbus found at La Navidad shattered his optimistic expectations. The small fort he had left behind was destroyed, burned to the ground. Bodies lay scattered around the site. Of the 40 men he had left there, not one survived. From the Taino, Columbus pieced together what had happened. The Spanish settlers had abused their welcome, stealing from the natives, demanding gold, and most catastrophically, abducting and assaulting Taino women. Chief Guacanagari had tried to maintain peace, but another chief, Caonabo, had had enough of Spanish violence. His warriors had attacked the settlement and killed all the Europeans. This disaster revealed fundamental problems with Spanish colonization that would only worsen over time. The men Columbus had left behind had not come as peaceful traders or respectful guests. They had behaved as conquerors entitled to take what they wanted. Their actions had provoked a violent response that, from the Taino perspective, was entirely justified self-defense. But Columbus chose to interpret the destruction of La Navidad not as a consequence of Spanish misconduct, but as evidence of indigenous treachery requiring punishment. Columbus established a new settlement, La Isabela, further east on the coast. It was to be the capital of his government, a proper Spanish town from which he would rule the territories claimed for Spain. But almost immediately, everything began to go wrong. The location proved poor. The harbor was not as good as other sites. Disease was rampant, and the land was less fertile than hoped. The colonists, many of whom were gentlemen expecting easy wealth rather than hard work, were ill-suited to the difficult task of building a settlement from scratch. Worse, there was far less gold than Columbus had suggested. The Taino did have some gold, primarily from rivers in the interior of the island, but nothing like the vast treasures Columbus had implied existed. The colonists, who had been promised riches, were bitterly disappointed. Instead of panning for gold themselves, which they considered beneath their dignity, they demanded that the Taino provide it. Columbus imposed a system requiring every Taino adult to deliver a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. Those who failed to meet this quota faced severe punishment. This tribute system was catastrophic for the Taino. They simply could not provide the amount of gold demanded. It didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Attempts to meet the impossible quotas disrupted their agricultural cycle, leading to food shortages. Spanish punishments for failure to deliver gold included mutilation, cutting off hands or ears, which terrorized the population. The Taino began to flee from areas under Spanish control, abandoning their villages to hide in the mountains. Columbus also authorized slave raids, sending expeditions to capture Taino people to be shipped back to Spain and sold. In 1495, he sent 4 ships carrying 500 enslaved Taino to Spain. About 200 died during the crossing, and the survivors were sold in Spanish markets. Queen Isabella was troubled by this. She questioned whether Columbus had the right to enslave people who were now technically her subjects. But the damage was done, and slavery would become a persistent feature of Spanish colonization. The admiral's attempts at governance grew increasingly desperate and harsh. He faced challenges from multiple directions. The Taino were resisting Spanish demands. The colonists were rebellious and unhappy. Disease was killing both Europeans and natives, and supplies from Spain were irregular. Columbus responded with authoritarian measures, handing out severe punishments for even minor infractions, executing some colonists in Taino for rebellion or theft. His rule became known for its cruelty and ineffectiveness. Some of the Spanish colonists, disgusted with conditions in Hispaniola and with Columbus's leadership, managed to return to Spain and complained bitterly to the monarchs. They painted a picture of chaos, brutality, and a governor completely out of his depth. Columbus's brothers, who served as his administrators, were particularly resented. Colonists felt they were being ruled by the entire Genoese family rather than by proper Spanish officials. Factions formed, with some colonists refusing to recognize Columbus's authority and attempting to return to Spain without permission. Columbus spent much of 1494 and 1495 exploring Cuba and Jamaica, perhaps partly to escape the problems at La Isabela. He still believed, or claimed to believe, that Cuba was part of mainland Asia, and he even forced his crew to sign documents swearing that it was continental land, not an island, threatening severe punishment for anyone who later contradicted this. This bizarre episode revealed Columbus's stubbornness and his difficulty accepting evidence that contradicted his theories. By 1496, Columbus decided he needed to return to Spain to defend his reputation and secure more support. He left his brothers in charge and sailed back to Spain with 2 ships, arriving in June. His reception was far less enthusiastic than after the first voyage. Yes, he had found new lands, but he had not delivered the promised wealth. His tales of gold and spices had proven exaggerated. The enslaved Taino he had sent were a poor substitute for the treasures of Asia he had claimed to have found. Columbus spent 2 years at the Spanish court, arguing for continued support and defending his governance of Hispaniola. He downplayed the reports of chaos and cruelty, blamed the rebellious colonists for any problems, and insisted that given more time and resources, the enterprise would prove profitable. Isabella and Ferdinand were uncertain. The colonies were costing money without generating significant returns, but they were reluctant to abandon the project after investing so much, and other European powers, especially Portugal, were watching with interest. To withdraw now would be seen as admission of failure. Finally, in 1498, Columbus was authorized to make a 3rd voyage, but the terms had changed. He was no longer the celebrated hero, but a controversial figure whose competence was questioned. The size of his fleet was smaller than the 2nd voyage, and he faced greater scrutiny from the crown. Still, he remained admiral and viceroy, technically in charge of Spain's American possessions. He set sail in May 1498, but the political situation in the colonies had deteriorated during his absence, and worse troubles awaited his return. Chapter 9. Chains and Humiliation. Columbus's 3rd voyage took a more southerly route, and on this expedition he finally reached the mainland of South America, landing on the coast of what is now Venezuela. He explored the Orinoco River delta, marveling at the enormous volume of fresh water flowing into the ocean. Such a river could only come from a vast continental landmass. This discovery should have made him question his assumption that he had found islands off the coast of Asia, but Columbus's thinking had become rigid. He briefly speculated that he might have found the biblical paradise, the Garden of Eden, but he still did not fully grasp that he had encountered an entirely new hemisphere unknown to European geography. When Columbus arrived back in Hispaniola in August 1498, he found the colony in open rebellion. During his 2-year absence, his brother Bartholomew had moved the capital from La Isabela to a new site on the south coast, founding the city of Santo Domingo. But this relocation had done nothing to solve the fundamental problems. The colonists still resented Columbus family rule. Gold was still scarce. Relations with the Taino had deteriorated into ongoing conflict, and accusations of mismanagement and cruelty continued to reach Spain. A significant rebellion was led by Francisco Roldan, a former mayor Columbus had appointed, who had turned against the Columbus brothers and gathered a faction of colonists in the western part of the island. Roldan and his followers refused to recognize Columbus's authority and demanded that the crown send a new governor. They wanted land grants and the right to use indigenous labor as they saw fit. Essentially, they wanted to be independent lords ruling their own estates, free from Columbus's interference. Columbus, exhausted and increasingly ill, tried to negotiate with Roldan. In a move that showed his weakening position, he made substantial concessions, granting land and indigenous laborers to the rebels. This compromise established the encomienda system, where Spanish colonists were given control over Taino communities, supposedly to protect and Christianize them, but in reality to exploit their labor. The system was brutally oppressive and contributed to the catastrophic decline of the indigenous population. The situation continued to spiral. Reports reached Spain painting Columbus as a tyrant who ruled through fear, who executed men for minor offenses, and who had allowed the colony to descend into chaos. Some reports were exaggerated by Columbus's enemies, but enough truth lay behind them that Ferdinand and Isabella felt compelled to act. In 1499, they appointed Francisco de Bobadilla as a royal commissioner with authority to investigate Columbus's governance and to take control if necessary. Bobadilla arrived in Santo Domingo in August 1500 when Columbus was away dealing with problems in another part of the island. What Bobadilla saw appalled him. 7 Spanish bodies were hanging from gallows in the town square, executed on Columbus's orders. More executions were scheduled. The colonists poured out complaints about Columbus's harsh rule and his brother's arrogance. Bobadilla quickly concluded that Columbus had failed as a governor and exceeded his authority in his treatment of both colonists and indigenous peoples. Using the broad powers granted him by the monarchs, Bobadilla ordered Columbus's arrest. When Columbus returned to Santo Domingo, he was seized and placed in chains. His brothers were also arrested. The admiral of the ocean sea, the man who had crossed the Atlantic and discovered new lands for Spain, was imprisoned like a common criminal. Bobadilla confiscated his property, took control of the government, and prepared to send him back to Spain to answer for his conduct. The journey back to Spain as a prisoner was deeply humiliating for Columbus. He was kept in chains aboard the ship, though the captain offered to remove them. Columbus refused, saying that only the monarchs who had placed him in chains could order them removed. This was partly pride. He wanted to arrive in Spain in shackles, making a dramatic statement about how he had been wronged. But it also reflected how completely his circumstances had changed. 7 years earlier, he had returned from his first voyage as a celebrated hero. Now he returned as a disgraced administrator, his reputation in tatters. The reality was that Columbus had proven to be a terrible governor. His skills lay in navigation and exploration, not in administration or diplomacy. He had been arbitrary and harsh in his punishments, unable to manage the conflicting interests of colonists, crown, and indigenous peoples. His insistence on maintaining absolute authority through his family had bred resentment. His exaggerated promises of wealth had created unrealistic expectations he couldn't fulfill, and his treatment of the Taino, imposing impossible demands and responding to resistance with violence, had been both cruel and counterproductive. When Columbus arrived in Spain in chains in November 1500, Ferdinand and Isabella were shocked by the sight. They immediately ordered his release and received him respectfully. Listening to his defense and his complaints about Bobadilla, they were sympathetic. They felt Bobadilla may have gone too far in arresting Columbus, but they did not restore his governorship. The investigation into his conduct continued, and while he remained technically admiral of the ocean sea, his power to govern the lands he had discovered was stripped away. Columbus spent the next year and a half trying to clear his name and regain his position. He wrote letters justifying his actions, blaming others for the problems in Hispaniola, and insisting he had been betrayed. He appealed to the monarch's sense of gratitude for his discoveries. He framed himself as a servant who had sacrificed everything for Spain's glory, only to be rewarded with chains and disgrace. There was truth in this. He had achieved something extraordinary, and his mistreatment was partly a result of jealousy and political maneuvering by his enemies. But there was also truth in the accusations against him. Columbus had been cruel and incompetent as a governor. His policies had contributed to the suffering and death of thousands of Taino people. His inability to manage the colony had cost Spain resources and credibility. The monarchs could honor his achievements as an explorer without restoring his failed experiment in governance. In the end, they reached a compromise. Columbus could make another voyage of exploration, but he would never again govern the territories he had discovered. Chapter 10. The Last Quest. By 1502, Columbus was over 50 years old, an advanced age for the time, and his health was failing. He suffered from arthritis that made movement painful, possibly from years of exposure to seawater and tropical diseases. His eyesight was deteriorating, but his spirit remained unbroken, and he was determined to make one more voyage, one final attempt to prove his theories and restore his reputation. The Catholic monarchs, perhaps moved by pity or lingering gratitude, authorized this fourth expedition. Columbus's goals for this voyage were clear. He wanted to find a strait or passage through the lands he had discovered, a waterway that would lead to the Indian Ocean and finally prove that he had indeed found a route to Asia. Other explorers had been probing the lands Columbus had discovered, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that these territories were more extensive than outlying islands should be. But Columbus still could not or would not accept that he had found an entirely new continent. He believed a passage must exist, and he was determined to find it. The fleet was small, just 4 ships, the largest only 70 tons, and about 150 men. Columbus's 13-year-old son Fernando accompanied him on this voyage, later writing a biography of his father. His brother Bartholomew also sailed, as did several loyal crew members from previous voyages. They departed Spain in May 1502, making directly for Hispaniola despite having been ordered to avoid the island to prevent conflicts with the new governor. Columbus arrived at Santo Domingo just as a hurricane was approaching. He sent a message warning the new governor, Nicolás de Ovando, of the storm and requesting permission to shelter in the harbor. Ovando, who disliked Columbus, refused him entry. Worse, Ovando had assembled a fleet to sail for Spain that very day, and he ignored Columbus's warning about the hurricane. The result was catastrophic. The storm struck, sinking most of Ovando's fleet and killing hundreds, including Bobadilla and Roldan, the men who had arrested Columbus and led the rebellion against him. Columbus's small fleet, warned in advance, found shelter and survived with only minor damage. From Hispaniola, Columbus sailed along the coast of Central America, exploring the shores of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. This was arduous exploration, probing rivers and inlets in search of the elusive strait. The coast ran obstinately east-west when Columbus wanted it to turn south toward the Indian Ocean. He encountered indigenous peoples who were sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, and who possessed gold in amounts that excited his interest, but not enough to justify the voyage in Spanish eyes. In Panama, Columbus heard reports of another ocean lying beyond the mountains to the south. This was the Pacific, though Columbus didn't realize it. He was tantalizingly close to understanding the geography, a narrow isthmus with an ocean on either side, but he remained convinced he was in Asia and that the Southern Ocean was the Indian Ocean. The truth eluded him because he was looking for what he expected to find rather than accepting what actually existed. The expedition faced mounting problems. The ship's hulls were being destroyed by teredo worms, shipworms that bored into wooden planks in tropical waters. Columbus tried to establish a small settlement at the mouth of a river in Panama, hoping to trade for gold with the local peoples, but relations quickly deteriorated into violence. Supplies ran low. The crews were exhausted and sick. By 1503, Columbus realized he had to abandon the search and try to return to Hispaniola for repairs and supplies. But the worm-damaged ships were barely seaworthy. On the voyage north, they began to fall apart. Water poured through holes in the hulls faster than the pumps could handle. In June 1503, Columbus made an emergency landing on Jamaica, where he deliberately ran his 2 remaining ships aground in a harbor to prevent them from sinking. The vessels would never sail again, and the expedition was now stranded on an island with no way to escape. The situation was desperate. Jamaica was inhabited but had no Spanish settlement, and they were far from help. Columbus sent his most trusted captain, Diego Mendez, with a small party in a dugout canoe to try to reach Hispaniola, over 100 miles away across open water. It was an incredibly dangerous journey, but Mendez succeeded, reaching Santo Domingo and requesting rescue for Columbus and his stranded crew. But help did not come quickly. Governor Ovando, who still resented Columbus, was in no hurry to rescue him. Months passed. Columbus and his men waited on the beached ships, their only shelter, subsisting on whatever they could trade with the Jamaicans for food. The indigenous peoples were initially helpful, but as time dragged on and the Spanish demands continued, they grew tired of supporting these uninvited guests. Some of Columbus's crew mutinied, stealing a canoe and trying to reach Hispaniola themselves, but they failed and returned to terrorize the island, attacking indigenous villages and stealing food. In a famous incident, Columbus used his knowledge of astronomy to overawe the Jamaicans and secure more supplies. He knew from his astronomical tables that a lunar eclipse was coming on February 29, 1504. He told the indigenous leaders that his god was angry they were not providing enough food and would turn the moon blood red as a sign of divine wrath. When the eclipse occurred exactly as predicted, the terrified Jamaicans agreed to provide more provisions. It was a clever trick, but it also showed Columbus's willingness to manipulate and intimidate to get what he needed. Finally, after more than a year stranded on Jamaica, a rescue ship arrived in June 1504. The survivors, fewer than 100 men, many ill and weakened, were taken to Santo Domingo. Columbus spent several weeks recovering before catching a ship back to Spain. He arrived in November 1504, broken in health, stripped of his governorship, his family fortune in dispute, and his reputation controversial at best. Worse, Queen Isabella, his most consistent supporter, died just weeks after his return. Columbus had lost his greatest patron at court. Chapter 11. Final Years. Christopher Columbus spent the last 18 months of his life largely confined to a house in Valladolid, Spain, racked by illness and consumed by bitterness over what he saw as ingratitude from the crown. He was not destitute. He had income from his positions and investments, but he felt cheated of the wealth and honors he believed he deserved. His letters from this period are filled with complaints about his treatment, demands for the restoration of his titles and privileges, and appeals to King Ferdinand for justice. The king, who had never been as sympathetic to Columbus as Queen Isabella, showed little inclination to fully restore his powers. Ferdinand acknowledged Columbus's discoveries and maintained his title as Admiral of the Ocean Sea, but the governorship of the Indies remained in other hands. A series of investigations into Columbus's financial claims dragged on, examining what profits he was entitled to under the original agreements. Columbus believed he was owed 10% of all profits from the lands he had discovered, a staggering sum if calculated fairly. But the Crown's accountants found ways to minimize this obligation. Columbus's physical condition deteriorated steadily. The arthritis that had plagued him for years worsened, making it difficult to move without pain. Some historians speculate he may have suffered from reactive arthritis, possibly triggered by foodborne illness during his voyages. Whatever the exact cause, his joints swelled, his mobility decreased, and he spent much of his time in bed, dictating letters and legal documents to his sons and servants. Despite his physical decline, Columbus remained mentally active and deeply concerned with his legacy. He compiled a collection of prophecies and biblical passages that he believed predicted his discoveries, creating a document called the Book of Prophecies. In this work, Columbus portrayed himself as an instrument of divine will, chosen by God to bring Christianity to unknown peoples and to help fulfill the scriptural promises about the spread of the faith to all corners of the earth. This religious interpretation of his voyages became increasingly important to Columbus in his final years, as if he was trying to ensure that history would remember him as more than just an explorer. He wanted to be seen as a divinely appointed missionary. His sons, Diego and Fernando, worked tirelessly on their father's behalf, presenting petitions to the king and trying to secure the family's rights and income. Diego, the elder son, would eventually receive many of his father's titles, though not all of the privileges Columbus had originally been promised. Fernando would become a scholar and bibliophile, creating one of Europe's finest libraries and writing a biography of his father that, while undoubtedly biased, remains an important source for understanding Columbus's life and character. Columbus also maintained correspondence with various figures at court and with other explorers. He followed with interest the ongoing discoveries being made in the lands he had first reached. Other captains were exploring the coasts, and it was becoming increasingly clear that these territories were vastly larger than Columbus had imagined. The Spanish had established more successful colonies in the Caribbean, and treasure ships were beginning to bring significant amounts of gold back to Spain. though not from the areas Columbus had governed. Yet Columbus never fully accepted the truth about what he had found. To his death, he insisted that he had reached the outlying areas of Asia, that Cuba was part of the Chinese mainland, that the lands he explored in Central America were near India. He could not or would not acknowledge that he had encountered an entirely new hemisphere, continents that had existed beyond European knowledge. This stubborn insistence on his original theory, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, has led some historians to question his later judgment. Was it pride or genuine conviction, or perhaps a mental rigidity that prevented him from seeing what was actually before him? As 1506 progressed, Columbus's health crisis worsened. He was largely bedridden by April, his body worn out by a lifetime of hardship at sea and the various ailments that now afflicted him. His sons and brother gathered around him as he composed his will, making provisions for his family and for charitable works. He remained concerned until the end about his titles and his financial claims, dictating codicils to his will that detailed what he believed he was owed and what should pass to his descendants. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died in Valladolid. He was probably 54 years old, though his exact birth year remains uncertain. His death was relatively quiet and unremarked. No crowds gathered, no state funeral was held. The man who had crossed the Atlantic and changed the course of history died as a controversial figure, remembered by some as a great explorer and by others as a failed governor who had treated indigenous peoples cruelly. Contemporary chroniclers noted his passing but did not yet grasp the full magnitude of what his voyages had initiated. Columbus was initially buried in Valladolid, but his remains would not rest there. His will had expressed a desire to be buried in Hispaniola, the land he had claimed for Spain. In 1509, his body was moved to Seville and interred in a monastery. Later, it was transported across the Atlantic to Santo Domingo, fulfilling his wish. But the story doesn't end there. His bones were moved again to Havana when Spain ceded Santo Domingo to France, and then back to Seville when Cuba gained independence. The true location of Columbus's remains is still debated, with both Seville and Santo Domingo claiming to possess the explorer's bones. This posthumous journey of his remains, crossing and recrossing the Atlantic, never finding permanent rest, seems almost metaphorical. Columbus in death, like Columbus in life, remained a figure of controversy and movement, never quite settled, always at the center of conflicting claims and interpretations. He had spent his adult life in motion, crossing seas and exploring coasts, never content to stay in one place. Perhaps it was fitting that even his bones could not rest peacefully. Chapter 12, A Contested Legacy. The true significance of Columbus's voyages became apparent only in the years and decades after his death. What he had actually discovered, not a route to Asia but an entire hemisphere previously unknown to Europeans, Africans, and Asians, proved far more important than what he had been searching for. His 4 voyages opened a permanent connection between the eastern and western hemispheres, initiating what scholars now call the Columbian Exchange, a massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, people, and ideas between the Old World and the New. The immediate consequences of Columbus's discoveries were catastrophic for indigenous peoples of the Americas. The arrival of Europeans brought diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and others, to which Native Americans had no immunity. These epidemics killed millions. devastating populations across the Caribbean and eventually throughout the Americas. The Taíno people of Hispaniola, who had numbered perhaps hundreds of thousands when Columbus arrived, were virtually extinct within a generation. Similar demographic collapses occurred across the hemisphere as European diseases spread faster than European people. Beyond disease, the European colonization that followed Columbus's voyages brought slavery, forced labor, cultural destruction, and systematic violence against indigenous peoples. The encomienda system Columbus had helped establish in Hispaniola was replicated throughout Spanish America, essentially enslaving native peoples. When indigenous populations declined, Europeans turned to Africa, shipping millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas to provide labor for plantations and mines. Columbus himself participated in the slave trade, both by enslaving indigenous people and by suggesting African slavery as an alternative labor source. Yet Columbus's legacy is complex and cannot be reduced to simple condemnation or celebration. His voyages required extraordinary courage, skill, and determination. Crossing the Atlantic in small ships with rudimentary navigation tools and no certain knowledge of what lay beyond the horizon was genuinely dangerous and required remarkable seamanship. Columbus's insistence on pursuing his vision despite years of rejection showed a kind of heroic persistence. His discoveries expanded human knowledge of geography and ultimately connected civilizations that had developed independently for thousands of years. The Columbian Exchange, while devastating to indigenous peoples, eventually transformed the entire world. European crops like wheat, rice, and coffee were introduced to the Americas. American crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes spread to Europe, Africa, and Asia, eventually feeding far larger populations than had been possible before. Horses brought by Europeans transformed Native American cultures on the Great Plains. The exchange of ideas, technologies, and peoples, though often achieved through violence and coercion, created the interconnected world we inhabit today. For centuries after his death, Columbus was celebrated in Europe and later in the Americas as a heroic figure, the man who discovered America. Cities, countries, and institutions were named after him: Columbia, the District of Columbia, Columbia University, and countless others. Monuments were erected in his honor. Columbus Day became a national holiday in the United States and many other countries. His story was taught to school children as an inspirational tale of persistence and bravery paying off against the odds. But this celebratory narrative ignored or minimized the devastation Columbus's arrival brought to indigenous peoples. It portrayed his discovery as the beginning of American history, erasing the thousands of years of human civilization that had existed in the Americas before 1492. It framed colonization as progress and development, rather than conquest and exploitation. In recent decades, this narrative has been increasingly challenged and revised. Many indigenous peoples and their advocates argue that Columbus Day should be replaced with Indigenous Peoples Day, honoring the original inhabitants of the Americas rather than the man whose arrival initiated their destruction. Statues of Columbus have been removed or defaced in various locations. Scholarly biographies now grapple with the full complexity of his legacy, neither wholly celebrating nor wholly condemning, but attempting to understand Columbus as a product of his time, whose actions had both remarkable and terrible consequences. The truth is that Columbus was neither the saintly hero of older narratives nor the simple villain of some modern critiques. He was an ambitious, skilled, stubborn, and deeply flawed human being. He was brave enough to sail into unknown waters, but cruel enough to enslave and brutalize those he encountered. He achieved something genuinely extraordinary, but did so through a combination of skill, luck, and willingness to exploit others. He opened doors that could never be closed, initiating changes that transformed the world, changes that brought both progress and catastrophe. Understanding Columbus requires holding these contradictions in mind simultaneously. His navigation skills and determination were remarkable. His treatment of indigenous peoples was appalling. His voyages expanded human knowledge and connection. His voyages also initiated conquest and genocide. He was a great navigator and a terrible governor. He was certain of his divine mission and fundamentally wrong about basic geography. He achieved lasting fame but died feeling unappreciated and cheated. Perhaps the most important lesson from Columbus's story is that history is rarely as simple as we want it to be. Great achievements can come with terrible costs. People we celebrate can also have committed actions we now recognize as unjust or cruel. The same events can represent discovery to one group and invasion to another. Columbus's voyages were one of history's pivotal moments, redirecting the course of human civilization. But whether that redirection was ultimately beneficial or harmful depends greatly on whose descendants are asking the question. More than 5 centuries after his death, Christopher Columbus remains a figure of debate and reinterpretation. Each generation reassesses his legacy in light of its own values and concerns. What seems unlikely to change is his historical significance. His voyages undeniably altered the course of world history, connecting hemispheres that had been separate, setting in motion changes that still shape our world today. Whether we view him as hero, villain, or something far more complicated, Christopher Columbus and his 4 voyages across the Atlantic remain central to any understanding of how the modern world came to be. And so we leave the story of the weaver's son from Genoa, who became an admiral, the explorer who was looking for Asia but found a new world, the man who achieved a dream but never understood what he had actually accomplished. His bones, like his legacy, continue to rest uneasily, claimed by multiple places, interpreted in multiple ways, never quite settled into a simple, comfortable story. History, like the ocean Columbus sailed, is deeper and more complex than any single narrative can fully capture.